Hi everyone, my name is Matt and welcome to my channel. Last week we painted the horses for these Ellyrian Reavers, and if you haven't watched that video yet, I would recommend watching it first, and you can check it out here. We also have some recipe cards available, and you can download them and print them out. Details about how to get them will be down in the description below. Today we'll continue painting the riders and the other remaining details, so grab your brushes and let's get started. I began by painting the skin with an equal parts mix of Darkoath flesh and contrast medium. Then I used a sharp brush to paint some undiluted Darkoath flesh directly into the deeper recesses. I mostly focused on the eyes, around the helmet, and between the fingers. Before I paint anything else, I want to paint a narrow black line around the skin areas. This technique is often called blacklining, and it will give the model extra definition. In the first video, when I painted the horses, I painted black lines around most of the other areas. If you feel like painting the eyes, now is a good time to do that. I like to start by painting the entire eye with black. Then I'll paint the eye white, leaving a thin black outline, and finally add a dot of black. With the black lines all painted, next I base coated the steel areas with Iron Hand steel. I'm not too worried if some of the steel gets on any unpainted areas, since I'll be using opaque paints for everything else. But I want to make sure not to spill any paint on the skin or on the horse. Next I shaded the steel with Gryph-Charger gray. Contrast paints are great for shading metallics, and Gryph-Charger gray has a nice tone which I think complements the rest of the color scheme. In addition to darkening the metal, the shade dulled down the shine quite a bit, and I'd like to highlight it with a quick dry brush of Iron Hand steel. I prefer to do the dry brushing stage before I paint anything else. That way I don't risk messing up any of the other colors. I'd like to paint the white cloth next, and before I can base coat it, I need to touch up any mistakes from all the previous layers. I undercoated these models with gray, followed by a white primer. The end result isn't a pure white, and the exact shade varies around the model. I used a few shades of very light gray, mixed from white and black paint, and touched up any areas that needed it. With the white undercoat touched up, next I base coated the white cloth with a mix of contrast medium and Stormvermin fur. This mix is about 4 parts contrast medium to 1 part Stormvermin fur, but you might want to dilute yours more or less. 4:1 is my best guess, but sometimes the thickness of base and layer paints can vary from batch to batch, and you might need more medium in your mix. Rather than trying to accurately measure the ingredients, I'd encourage you to mix until the shade looks right to you. After base coating the white, I painted another black line wherever the white meets up against an unpainted section. I prefer to do this after painting each section, since this model has a lot of different overlapping details. It can be a little time consuming, but it will add a lot of extra definition to the model, and I think that's worth it. Next I painted some of the cloth with Kantor blue, leaving a thin black outline. After the first layer dried, I painted a second for an even finish. If you watched my other High Elf videos, you may remember that I used contrast paint for the dark blue. These models have so many different colors and overlapping sections, using contrast paint becomes more trouble than it's worth. So for this color, I'm using a traditional base and layer approach, and it should look close to the contrast version when it's finished. Now that the blue is looking smooth and even, I shaded it with a layer of Nuln Oil. Now is a great time for me to ask you to do those YouTube things that we all love so much. If you're liking the video so far, please give it a like. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on any future content. If you really like what I'm doing here and want to support the channel further, please consider Patreon or a YouTube channel membership. We have some perks including a Discord server, printer-friendly PDF files of our new recipe cards, and early access to videos. Next I base coated the light blue areas with Caledor Sky, and I made sure to leave a narrow black outline around each of the sections. After the first layer dried, I painted a second for a solid, even finish. Then I shaded the blue with Magos purple. It may seem a little odd to shade blue with purple, but once it dries, it just looks like a darker blue. I really like the subtle effect. If you prefer a dark blue shade, I would recommend Drakenhof Nightshade instead. Next I painted the bow, spear, and hair with Bonewhite. And again I made sure to leave a narrow black outline wherever it meets up against another color. Then I shaded the bow and spear with Skeleton Horde. This recipe is slightly different from my other High Elf models, but the end result will look similar. In order to match the other models, I would have to repaint them with white first, and that would take a lot more time. Base coating with Bonewhite instead is quicker, and it looks close enough. Next I base coated the leather with Dryad bark. This is another recipe that I changed from the original contrast version in order to save time. The end result will look pretty close, so you could choose whichever recipe you prefer. With the base coat dry, I shaded the leather with Nuln Oil. Painting the wash all over the leather will make it too dark, so instead I painted it directly into the recesses. There are a few different ways I like to paint blonde hair, starting from a base coat of Bonewhite. The first one is Skeleton Horde, followed by a layer of Cassandora yellow. The second is Nosdrag yellow. Next is Nuln Oil. Agaros Dunes. And finally Garragax Sewer with about 4 parts contrast medium. Next I painted the gold with Retributor armor. Prior to painting the gold, I added a few black outlines anywhere that needed it, such as the details on the bow. After the first layer of gold dried, I painted a second for a bright, even finish. Then I shaded all the gold with Skeleton Horde. I'd like to paint some of the feathers in a complementary color, and I decided to go with a bluish green. I base coated all the feathers with Sybarite green, and you may need a second layer for an even finish. Then I painted over the feathers with Aeldari emerald. I wasn't sure how I wanted to paint the arrows, so I saved them for last, but I ended up deciding to go with white. I base coated the arrows and champion's crest with gray number 8 from my custom grayscale, and you can learn how to mix your own set in this video here. I'd like the feathers to stand out from the other white on the models, so I shaded those areas with Apothecary white. This is a cooler, bluish leaning shade. Finally, I added some markings to the champion's helmet with Sybarite green, followed by a layer of Aeldari emerald. At this stage you could base the models and call them finished, but I'd like to add some highlights, so let's keep going. Let's start off by highlighting the white with some glazes of gray number 8 from my custom grayscale. Dilute the paint with water and build up layers on the raised edges and folds. For the best results, focus on keeping the layers as smooth and as even as possible. This color is really light, basically a few drops of black paint mixed into a whole pot of white. It looks white next to all the other colors on the model, but since it has that small amount of black mixed in, it leaves a little bit of room to highlight with pure white afterwards. I'd like to add some extra detail to these straps, so I used some less diluted gray and painted every other rectangle, leaving a thin, dark outline around each one. Next, I highlighted the edges of all the white cloth with pure white. There are a few different brands that make really good bright white paint. I prefer Vallejo Game Color. If you like a different brand, please share it down in the comments. Moving on to the light blue next. I highlighted all those areas with Caledor sky. On the larger sections, like this sleeve, I wanted a smoother blend, so I diluted the paint with water and applied a couple glazes. On the smaller sections, I used undiluted paint and picked out the edges. I also filled in the remaining rectangles on the sides, again making sure to leave a thin, dark outline. Next, I highlighted the blue with an equal parts mix of Caledor sky and Lothern blue. Next, I highlighted the leather in 2 stages, beginning with a thin glaze of Steel Legion Drab. Dilute the paint with water, and with barely any paint on the brush, apply a thin layer on the model. The paint should dry almost as soon as it leaves the brush. More paint will collect when you lift the brush off the model, so I like to move the brush from the center towards the edges. That way it creates a natural highlight there. Once I was happy with the glazes, I used some less diluted Steel Legion Drab and painted the edges. I highlighted the wood next with Bonewhite, thinned slightly with water. I like to paint a wood grain kind of effect along the length of the wood. I'll look for any areas where the shade dried unevenly and use those as a starting point for where to place the lines. If the shade dried too dark in some areas, I'll cover it up with either a line highlight or dilute the Bonewhite with more water and paint a glaze. I highlighted the hair next with thinned Offwhite. This is a pretty big jump up in value, so I want to make the paint semi-transparent. Dilute it with plenty of water, and with barely any paint on your brush, add a very narrow highlight along some of the edges. Let's highlight the dark blue next, and this process is the same as the cloaks in my Shadow Warriors video. The only thing different was the base coat. If you haven't seen that video yet, you can check it out here. Thin down some Fang gray with plenty of water, and with barely any paint on your brush, build up a series of glazes on the larger, smooth sections. There should be barely any paint on your brush, and it should dry almost immediately. If the paint runs or flows into the recesses, it means your brush is overloaded. Glazing should be a very controlled process, and the less paint you have on your brush, the more control you have over where it goes. If you make any mistakes, you can easily correct them with a glaze of Kantor blue. Once I was happy with the glazed highlights, I took some less diluted gray paint and added a sharp line highlight along the edges. Next, I highlighted the sharpest edges and corners with Russ gray. Just a couple details left to go. Next I highlighted the steel with Stormhost silver. You could dry brush this stage if you want to save time, and if you choose to do that, I would recommend dry brushing it earlier before painting everything else. I prefer the cleaner look of edge highlights, so that's what I'll be doing here. Then I highlighted the edges of the gold with an equal parts mix of Retributor armor and Stormhost silver. If you don't feel like mixing anything, Liberator gold is a close match. I highlighted the green feather with Sybarite green and a touch of white mixed in. Depending on how light or dark your contrast layer dried, you may need more or less white in your mix. I undercoated all the gems with black paint, and then I base coated them with Khorne red, leaving a thin black outline. I highlighted the bottom half with Evil Sunz Scarlet. I painted a smaller crescent along the bottom with Fire Dragon. And then I painted a very narrow line along the bottom with Toxic Yellow. Finally, I added a white dot on the top. These models were on the old size bases, so I replaced them with the new size. I used an old brush to apply a generous layer of wood glue to the top of the bases, and then I sprinkled on some coarse gravel and fine sand. After the glue dried, I painted the base with a layer of thinned Rhinox hide, followed by a heavy dry brush of Mournfang brown, then a lighter dry brush of Balor brown, and finally a light dry brush of Bonewhite. I painted the rocks with Dawnstone, and then shaded them with a mix of Agrax Earthshade and Nuln Oil. I painted the edge of the base with Mournfang brown, and then applied patches of static grass with superglue. I used some wood and plasticard to build a movement tray for the unit, and you can see how I made them in this video here. I'd like to give a big shout out to our supporters here on YouTube and now on Patreon as well. Thank you so much for your support. It really is a huge help. If you want to be like these amazing people and help support what I'm doing here, just click the join button down below or follow the Patreon link in the video description. Thank you. I enjoyed painting some cavalry, especially taking some extra time to paint each horse differently. They took a lot longer than foot troops, but I think it's important to switch it up now and then. I'm also glad that now I have some non-contrast recipes for the leather and dark blue, and they look pretty close to the contrast versions. That's always a challenge when designing a color scheme. What High Elf models would you like to see next? Drop a comment below and share your thoughts. Well, that's it for now. Thanks for watching, and until next time, happy painting!